From the moment a carcass starts on its way along the line, federal meat inspectors stand guard to protect you, the consumer. All meat that passes inspection is stamped with a round purple mark of wholesomeness.
I first heard about this story because Consumer Reports came across some data released from the USDA that showed very low levels of drug residues in meat samples that were tested by the USDA.
We became aware about a year ago that this database existed with information from a USDA program that looks at drug residues in meat and poultry.
What was explosive is immediately seeing these drugs which were never approved for use in food animals, that were banned years ago because they're highly hazardous, still showing up in the food supply. It was sort of stunning.
So Consumer Reports scientists analyzed the data, all of the data, and we concluded very definitively that there is something wrong with how meat is produced in this country.
How long have you been in this food space?
Oh, I've been doing food safety work for a couple of decades.
How alarming, surprising, whatever word you want to use, is this?
This is surprising and unusual in my experience. I mean, sometimes you will find an agency that's not stringently enforcing the law, and we do that, and we criticize them, and they have various ways of responding. You know, a typical response is, well, we don't have the resources for that, or it's on our priority list and we haven't gotten to it yet. It's very rare that they try to deny the validity of their own data. I've never seen an agency before try to deny that their own data is valid and significant.
So you've described the amended report as non-detect. But those results were initially reported with numbers. Right. So some of those we have...
No, sir. There were not numbers. There were responses from the instrument that were not validated to be representative of what that number meant. They're preliminary data, and I cannot consider that a quantified data.
It's also unusual that they seem to be so unwilling to consider looking into the problem. You know, usually our complaint is the agency says, oh, well, we'll look into this, and then they don't do anything. But here, USDA is really saying, oh, no, we're not even going to look into this.
We're concerned about public health, particularly when exposure is to huge numbers of people. And so that's why I think people should be concerned, and they should be concerned that not only is the USDA not doing anything, they're not even letting the agencies that do the enforcement, particularly FDA, know that this data is there, because if FDA was sent and told about this, they would by law have to go out and go to the farm and do something about it.
There's a lot of reasons that I left, but the main thing was I didn't see anything changing in the immediate future, and I just didn't want any more to do with it. A contract poultry producer is kind of a unique thing. The farmer actually owns the buildings and the land, supplies the labor, supplies the utilities, all that sort of thing. The company actually retains ownership of the feed and the chicks. Basically, we just get them on consignment, we raise them up to a certain weight, and the company comes and picks them up if they want 4 pounds, they come get them at 4 pounds. If they want 5 pounds, they come get them at 5 pounds. And that's kind of the relationship. We did make some money initially. I think most farmers that are in the chicken business you talk to, we call it the honeymoon phase. In the beginning, it's always good. And then, 3 or 4 years you're into it and you're thinking, oh my Lord, what did I do? And you find out that the farmers, you own the farm, but you don't control the farm. The winning farmers are the farmers who can get the bird the fattest, the quickest. As far as finding stuff that's residues on the meat that shouldn't be there, was I surprised now?
Animals coming under federal inspection are carefully examined by thoroughly trained USDA meat inspectors. Livestock unfit for human consumption is slaughtered separately and converted to fertilizer or other non-food uses.
define what a drug residue is?
Yes, you get a residue when the drug has not fully cleared the animal. And we looked particularly, for example, into the drug chloramphenicol. It's an antibiotic. It's completely prohibited by the Food and Drug Administration for use in food animals because residues can be hazardous to the consumer.
Chloramphenicol is clearly a problem because even at trace levels, the FDA has said that could cause aplastic anemia, and that's why any residue is unacceptable. Phenylbutazone, and that one also has this problem with aplastic anemia, which could be dosage independent. Nitroimidazoles, our safety agencies say that they're likely considered human carcinogens.
For some of these drugs, it's okay to use the drug under a veterinarian's supervision if it will clear the animal by the time it gets to the consumer. An example of that one is ketamine, its street name Special K, a restricted drug, sometimes hallucinogen, that can be used actually under a veterinarian's supervision if it clears the animal by the time it gets to the consumer. USDA's data shows that it's still present in dozens of samples of meat and poultry. So this is an example of improper usage, which USDA should be investigating and should be preventing.
Under my father's watch and mine, this farm had been reduced to a monoculture of only cattle. One of my favorite sayings is, nature abhors a monoculture. This earth evolved with many, many, many different species of microbes and plants and animals living in symbiotic relationships with each other. Today, we pasture raise 5 different red meat species. We pasture raise and hand butcher 5 different poultry species. We hand butcher them here on the farm in the USDA inspected plant. The changes I made were not financially driven. They were driven by an increasing dissatisfaction on my part of the way I was farming. I probably became aware because I was the excessive user. I pushed the limits on all of the tools I was using. If the label instructions said only inject 1 cc, I might put 2. And if it said only apply 1 quart per acre, I might put 2 quarts per acre. People don't always do exactly what they're supposed to do. These prohibited drugs have been found in samples of meat, and I guess that would be pretty proof positive that somebody somewhere wasn't doing what they're supposed to do. Yeah, I mean, if you're surprised by that, you're pretty naive.
In the lab, the skills and techniques of the scientists will answer the inspector's questions. This bacteriologist tests for evidence of antibiotics or other preservatives, which are not permitted in federally inspected products.
In very broad terms, the FSIS does regularly test meat samples at slaughterhouses across the country and bring it to a lab and run it through a very sophisticated testing procedure to test for things that shouldn't be in there. So when the USDA does find a violative sample, that gets reported to the FDA. And it is, to be clear, the FDA who is responsible for enforcing and issuing sanctions.
In 2012, USDA acquired what is modern contemporary testing equipment. It is much better than all previous lab methods at detecting chemicals in meat and poultry. And so this allowed them to detect residues at lower levels than they had previously found them.
That's when the MLA was created. It was this extra threshold level.
USDA has something called a minimum level of applicability. And they say that any drug residue below their minimum level, or MLA, is nothing to worry about, nothing to be concerned about.
Well, there was a lot of confusion about the MLA. I was actually talking to veterinarians, toxicologists, and many of them didn't really understand what the MLA was. Outside of the USDA, the MLA is a vague concept.
It's not just a problem about oversight, it's a problem about how FSIS assesses their data. That is a grave concern of ours. The fact that they do not use the same standards that the FDA uses and the EPA uses, as well as others in the scientific community, that is of notable concern for us.
We're basically saying you should use limit of detection and limit of quantification for your cutoffs rather than what we would call the non-scientific term minimum level of applicability. Because for any other drug that is tested by FDA or EPA and that, everybody does that. It's limit of detection and limit of quantification.
But what's even more sort of disconcerting is that even where USDA found residues above its own minimum level of applicability, it still didn't do anything about enforcing the law.
We've tried to explain to you that data was released in error. It is raw, unprocessed data. And because it is raw, unprocessed data, I cannot consider those numbers in any way determinative or quantified results in any such way.
How has the USDA responded to this thus far?
Their response has been somewhat confusing. They've had a number of different explanations, but their latest position is that the data that we have looked at, which came from their testing lab, was not confirmed and therefore should not be paid any attention to.
What does that mean in terms of not confirmed?
Well, that's a very good question. It's very unclear. They have not made clear what they mean exactly by not confirmed.
I looked at the data, and I looked at the data, all the data that was presented to us. And in my assessment of the data that was presented to us, there were definite presences of drug residue from their studies. That was unequivocal.
They now have 21st century science, but they don't have 21st century regulations to deal with it.
A plentiful supply of nutritious, wholesome food will keep our nation strong. Abundant protein-rich meat contributes to the well-being and strength of our people and our country. Meat is a favorite with almost everyone, everywhere.
So millions of Americans every day eat meat safely. But it doesn't mean that there can't be things to be done to make the food system safer for everyone. And so if you're concerned about eating meat, there are a couple things you can do. One is to reduce your intake of meat on a daily or weekly basis. You can also think about alternatives, such as eating organic meat. Now, the labels that exist that identify meat as organic don't guarantee that there are no residues whatsoever of drugs. But the federal guidelines and standards for organic are much stricter, much more robust than for those that are not organic. And so that gives you a little bit more information, a little bit more security in your choices.
What is Consumer Reports calling on?
We believe several things should happen. First of all, USDA should admit that they are finding residues of drugs in meat and poultry, and they should use standard scientific systems for assessing their data. And then when they look at the data and find residues, particularly of drugs that FDA has said should never be used in food animals, they should themselves investigate why this is happening. And then they should turn the data over to FDA for enforcement actions. And we also have a message to FDA, which is that FDA should vigorously enforce the law.
Do you have any confidence, knowing the USDA as you do, that this will change?
I would certainly hope that it would. Given the line of work I'm in, I'm always optimistic. And I think there are people in these agencies who take their responsibilities very seriously. And I would hope that in this situation they will prevail.